I didn't know his name that night, but I remember the way his voice sounded. Calm, controlled, like someone who had never been told no. And the first thing he ever said to me was, "Don't fall in love." It should have been ridiculous, the kind of line you laugh off and walk away from. Except nothing about him felt like something you could walk away from. The city was drowning in rain, the kind that blurred streetlights into gold streaks across wet asphalt. And I was standing under a flickering bus stop sign on 8th Avenue, counting the last $6 in my wallet and wondering how long instant noodles could realistically count as dinner when a black car pulled up too smoothly, too quietly, like it belonged to a different world than mine. And the door opened before I even realized it had stopped for me. I didn't get in because I wanted to. I got in because the storm hit harder, because the last bus had already passed, because sometimes life doesn't feel like choices, it feels like momentum. And once you're moving, you don't know how to stop. The interior smelled like leather and something sharper, expensive. And when I looked up, he was already watching me, not the way men usually look at women, not curious, not impressed, just aware, like he was cataloging every detail I hadn't meant to show, the worn edges of my jacket, the way I kept my shoulders tight, the instinct to stay close to the door. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, and it didn't sound like concern, it sounded like fact. I told him I was fine, that I didn't need help, that I was just waiting for a ride, even though we both knew that wasn't true. And for a second, I thought he might let it go, that he'd nod and drive away and I'd never see him again. But instead he leaned back slightly, studying me like I was a question he hadn't decided to answer yet. "I don't do favors," he added, voice low, steady. "And I don't do complications, so if you're getting in, you follow my rules." And I remember laughing, just a little, because something about the way he said it felt unreal, like a scene from a movie I hadn't agreed to be part of. "I don't even know you," I said, and that was when his expression shifted, not softer, not warmer, just sharper, more certain, like he had already decided something about me that I didn't get to vote on. "Exactly," he replied, and then, after a pause that felt longer than it should have, "Don't fall in love." Like it was a warning, like it was a boundary, like it was something he had every intention of enforcing. And I should have left then, should have opened the door and stepped back into the rain. But instead I stayed, because the storm outside felt smaller than the silence inside that car. And because for the first time in a long time, I had the strange, unsettling feeling that this moment wasn't random at all, that somehow, without meaning to, I had already stepped into something I didn't understand, something that would not let me walk away clean. And as the car pulled back into the empty street, the city sliding past in blurred reflections, I told myself it was just a ride, just a stranger, just one night, and I believed that, right up until the moment I realized he hadn't asked me where I was going, because wherever I thought I was headed no longer mattered, not once I was inside his world. The city lights kept sliding past the window like streaks of something I could not quite hold on to. And I realized after a few minutes that I had stopped watching where we were going because something about him made direction feel irrelevant, like the destination had already been decided the moment I closed that door. I shifted slightly in the seat, fingers tightening around the strap of my bag, and finally said the first thing that felt real enough to anchor me. "You still have not told me your name." And for a second I thought he might ignore it, the same way he ignored red lights by timing them perfectly. The same way he ignored the tension sitting between us like a third passenger. But then he glanced at me, just once, and it was enough to make my breath catch, because his eyes were not cold the way I expected. They were focused, intentional, like everything he did had already been calculated 3 steps ahead. "Adrian," he said, and the name settled in the space between us, with a weight that did not match its simplicity, like it belonged on something bigger than just a man sitting behind a steering wheel. And I nodded, not because it meant anything yet, but because it felt like I was supposed to remember it. "Emily," I replied, and this time he did not look at me, but I saw the faintest shift in his jaw, like he had already filed it away somewhere important. The silence came back after that, heavier now, not empty but full of things neither of us was saying, and I told myself again that this was just a ride, just a stranger with an expensive car and an even more expensive sense of control. But then the car slowed, not near my apartment, not anywhere I recognized, and my chest tightened as I looked outside and saw a building that did not belong to my world, all glass and steel and quiet security, the kind of place where people did not worry about $6 or bus schedules. "This is not my stop," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but it came out softer than I wanted, and for the first time since I got in, Adrian actually turned fully toward me, one hand still resting on the wheel, the other relaxed but deliberate, like even stillness was a choice for him. "I know," he said, and there was no apology in it, no explanation, just certainty, and something in my chest reacted before my mind could catch up, a sharp instinct to leave, to open the door and step back into the version of my life that made sense, even if it was hard, even if it was small. "Then, why are we here?" I asked, and he studied me for a moment that felt longer than it should have, like he was measuring not just the question but the way I asked it, the way I held myself, the way I did not immediately run. "Because you saw something you should not have," he said finally, voice low but even, and I froze, replaying the last hour in my head. The rain, the street, the way I had glanced back before getting into the car, the brief moment when another vehicle had passed too close, too fast, something I had dismissed at the time but now felt heavier under his words. "I did not see anything," I said quickly, maybe too quickly, and his expression did not change, but the silence that followed told me he did not believe me, or worse, that it did not matter whether I was telling the truth. "That is the problem," he replied, and then he opened his door, stepping out into the quiet like he owned it, like the world adjusted around him instead of the other way around. And when he came around to my side, opening the door without asking, I hesitated, just for a second, because somewhere deep down I understood that this was the moment everything could still go back to normal, and that if I stepped out now, if I followed him into whatever this place was, normal would not exist for me anymore. "You are not being forced," he said, as if he could hear the thought before I spoke it. But there was something in his tone that made the words feel less like freedom and more like a test. And I realized then that he did not need to force anything, not when he could simply make every other option feel smaller, less safe, less possible. And against every instinct that told me to walk away, I stepped out of the car and into his world, telling myself I was still in control, even as I felt that control slipping quietly, dangerously, into his hands. The lobby was too quiet for a place that large, the kind of silence that felt intentional, like even sound had to ask permission to exist there, and my shoes made soft echoes against the polished floor as I followed half a step behind him, not because he told me to, but because something about his presence made it feel like the only natural position. The glass doors closed behind us without a sound, sealing off the storm outside like it had never been there. And for a moment I stood still, taking in the space, the high ceilings, the clean lines, the kind of understated luxury that did not need to prove anything to anyone. And I felt it again, that sharp awareness of how out of place I was, like I had walked into someone else's life by accident. "You can still leave," Adrian said without turning around, his voice carrying easily through the empty space, and I almost believed him. Almost. Because technically the doors were still behind me, still reachable. But the way he said it made it clear that leaving was not as simple as walking out. Not anymore. "Then why bring me here?" I asked, and this time my voice held, steady enough to surprise even me. And he stopped walking, just for a second, before continuing toward the elevators like the question had already been answered in his head. "Because I do not like variables," he said, and I frowned, not fully understanding but knowing enough to feel the implications settle under my skin, that somehow I had become something unpredictable in his world, something he needed to control. The elevator arrived almost immediately, the doors sliding open with a soft chime, and we stepped inside, the space smaller now, more contained, the distance between us suddenly noticeable in a different way, and I became aware of everything at once, the faint scent of his cologne, the way his reflection stood beside mine in the mirrored walls, taller, sharper, like we belonged to two completely different stories that had been forced into the same frame. "What happens now?" I asked, watching the numbers climb even though I did not know which floor we were heading to. And he pressed a button near the top without hesitation, his movements precise, unhurried. "Now," he said, glancing at me briefly, "you understand the rules. And something in the way he said it made my chest tighten, not fear exactly, but the awareness that this moment mattered more than anything that had happened so far. The elevator doors opened onto a floor that looked more like a private residence than anything else. Warm lighting, dark wood, windows stretching out toward the city like a view most people only saw in magazines. And I stepped out slowly, taking it in, trying not to let it show how much it unsettled me, how much it made everything feel even more unreal. "You will stay here tonight," he continued, walking past me as if the decision had already been made, and I turned quickly, the words hitting harder than I expected. "I did not agree to that," I said, and for the first time, he stopped completely, turning to face me fully, his expression calm but unreadable, like he had been expecting resistance and was simply waiting to see how far I would push it. "You got into my car," he replied, not harsh, not raised, just stated, and somehow that made it more difficult to argue, because it was true, because every step after that had been mine, even if it did not feel that way now. "That does not mean I belong here," I said, holding his gaze even though something inside me told me to look away, and for a second, something flickered in his eyes, not anger, not surprise, something sharper, more interested, like I had just confirmed something he had been testing. "No," he said slowly, taking a step closer but stopping just short of closing the distance completely. "It means you are under my protection." And the word protection should have felt reassuring, should have made this easier to accept, but the way he said it carried something heavier, something that blurred the line between safety and control. "And your rules," I added, remembering the words from the car, and he nodded once, a small, decisive movement. "No questions that do not concern your safety," he said, his voice steady, measured. "No leaving without telling me, and most importantly," he paused, just long enough for the silence to stretch, for the weight of what he was about to say to settle in before it even reached me. "No feelings." And I felt something shift inside my chest at that, something I could not quite name, because the rule itself did not make sense, not in a situation that already felt like it had been built on something deeper than logic. "You really think you can control that?" I asked quietly, and this time, the hint of something almost like a smile touched his expression, brief and gone before I could be sure it was there at all. "I always do," he said, and for the first time since I met him, I was not sure if he was warning me or himself. The silence after his last words did not feel empty. It felt structured, like something carefully built to hold its shape, and I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, trying to decide whether to challenge him again or to understand what I had already stepped into, because the truth was I had never been in a place like this before. Not just the apartment with its quiet luxury and endless view of the city, but this kind of dynamic, where every word felt like it carried more weight than it should. I walked slowly toward the window, more for something to do than anything else, my reflection faint against the glass as the city stretched out below, miles of lights and movement that suddenly felt very far away, like a different life I had already left behind without meaning to. "You think this is temporary," Adrian said from somewhere behind me, and I did not turn right away, because I knew if I did, I would be pulled back into that focus of his, that way he looked at people like they were pieces in something larger. "I know it is," I replied, quieter now, but still holding on to that certainty because I needed it. And I finally faced him, finding him exactly where I expected, composed, watching, like nothing about this situation felt unusual to him at all. "People like me do not stay in places like this," I added, gesturing slightly around the room. And something shifted again in his expression, not disagreement, not amusement, something closer to curiosity. "You already are," he said simply, and I opened my mouth to argue, to say that this was not the same thing, that being here for one night did not mean anything. But the words did not come out the way I expected, because part of me understood what he meant, that crossing a line once made it easier to cross. Again, I exhaled slowly, shaking my head as if that could reset everything, and moved past him, creating distance because I needed it, because standing too close to him made it harder to think clearly, like the air itself shifted when he was near. "I am leaving in the morning," I said, more firmly this time, and he nodded once, not arguing, not stopping me, and somehow that made it worse, because it felt like he was allowing it rather than agreeing. like even my decisions were being filtered through his control. "If that is what you choose," he replied, and I turned sharply at that, catching the subtle emphasis, the way he framed it like a decision that could change, like something he expected. "Would, it is," I insisted, and for a brief second, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, more like acknowledgement, as if I had just confirmed something he already believed. "Then you should rest," he said, stepping back slightly, giving me space in a way that felt intentional, like he knew exactly how much pressure to apply and when to release it. "There is a guest room," he added, gesturing down a hallway lined with soft light and closed doors, and I hesitated again, not because I did not understand what he meant, but because every part of this felt like a sequence I was following without fully choosing. "Emily," he said, and my name sounded different in his voice, steadier, more grounded, and I looked at him instinctively. "You are safe here." And the words should have reassured me, should have made this easier to accept, but instead they settled somewhere deeper, because I realized safety in his world did not mean the same thing it did in mine. It meant controlled, contained, protected under his rules. I nodded anyway, because arguing that point felt pointless now, and turned toward the hallway, each step quieter than the last, the space around me too still, too controlled. And when I reached the room at the end, I paused with my hand on the door, listening to nothing, no movement, no sound from behind me. And for the first time since I stepped into that car, I felt something else slip in alongside the uncertainty, something quieter but more dangerous. The awareness that he was not trying to force me to stay, not really, because he did not have to, because somehow, in ways I could not fully explain yet, he was already making it harder for me to leave. I did not sleep the way I thought I would, not in a place like that where everything was softer, quieter, more perfect than anything I was used to, because comfort like that does not always mean rest. Sometimes it means your mind refuses to settle, replaying every detail until it no longer feels like chance. I lay there staring at the ceiling for what felt like hours, listening to the faint hum of the city far below, trying to convince myself that morning would reset everything, that I would wake up, leave, and this would become one of those strange stories you tell once and never again. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the way he looked at me, like I was something he had already decided not to let go of. When I finally did drift off, it was shallow, restless, and I woke before sunrise without an alarm, my body already tense, already alert, like it understood before my mind did that something had changed. The room was still dim, the light outside just beginning to soften the edges of the skyline. And for a moment I stayed still, listening, expecting to hear movement somewhere in the apartment. But there was nothing, just that same controlled silence that had been there the night before. I sat up slowly, running a hand through my hair, grounding myself in small, familiar motions, and reminded myself again of the plan. Leave early, do not overthink it. Do not let him turn this into something bigger than it already was. I got dressed quickly, using the neatly folded clothes I found placed outside the door sometime during the night, and that detail alone made me pause for a second longer than I should have, because I had not heard anyone come or go, and yet someone had. Someone had been close enough to leave something for me without disturbing that silence, and I did not know why that unsettled me more than anything else. I stepped out into the hallway, my footsteps quiet against the floor, and followed it back toward the main space, expecting it to be empty, expecting to slip out unnoticed. But he was already there, standing near the window with a cup of coffee in his hand like he had been there long before I woke up, like he had expected this exact moment. "You are leaving," he said without turning. And it was not a question, not even close, and I stopped a few feet away, unsure whether to respond or just continue toward the door, because something about the way he stood there made it clear he already knew what I was going to do. "Yes," I said, finally, keeping my voice steady, and he nodded once, taking a slow sip from his cup before setting it down on the counter beside him, his movements unhurried, controlled, like time worked differently around him. "Good," he replied, and the word caught me off guard, because it was not what I expected, not resistance, not persuasion, just agreement, and for a second, I felt something shift, a small, unexpected sense of relief. "Then I will go," I added, taking a step toward the door, but he moved then, not fast, not sudden, just enough to place himself slightly in my path without making it feel like a block. And I stopped instinctively, my breath catching in a way I did not want to acknowledge. "There is one thing you should understand before you do," he said, his voice lower now, quieter but somehow more present, and I forced myself to meet his gaze, even though it felt like stepping into something deeper than I intended. "Last night was not random," he continued, holding my attention without effort. "And neither are you." And my chest tightened at that, because I wanted to dismiss it, to call it coincidence, to reduce it to something simple. But the certainty in his voice made that difficult. "You do not know me," I said, the words coming out sharper than I expected, and for a moment, something in his expression shifted again, not anger, not offense, something closer to interest, like I had just given him a reason to keep going. "No," he agreed, taking a small step closer, closing just enough distance to make it impossible to ignore his presence. "But I will." And the way he said it was not a promise, not exactly, but it felt like one, something inevitable rather than optional. And I realized then that leaving this place might not mean leaving him, that whatever line I had crossed the moment I got into that car had not disappeared overnight. It had only become clearer, more defined. And as I stood there with my hand just inches from the door, I understood for the first time that walking away would not be as simple as I had told myself it would be. I should have left right then, should have pushed past him, opened the door, and stepped back into the version of my life that made sense. But my hand stayed where it was, hovering just inches from the handle, because something in the way he said those words did not feel like pressure. It felt like inevitability, and that was harder to fight. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to move, to close the distance between intention and action, and when my fingers finally wrapped around the handle, I felt his presence shift behind me, not closer, not touching, but there in a way that made the space feel smaller, more defined. "Emily," he said again, and I stopped, not because I wanted to, but because my body reacted before my mind could catch up. And I hated that, hated how easily he could do that without raising his voice, without reaching for me, just by saying my name like it already belonged to him. "What?" I asked, turning just enough to face him without fully stepping away from the door, keeping that line between us even if it felt thinner now. "You are thinking about leaving like it ends something," he said, his tone calm, measured, like he was explaining something simple, something obvious, and I frowned, tightening my grip slightly as if that would ground me. "It does," I replied, sharper than before, because I needed it to be true. "This was one night, that is all." And for a second, he just looked at me, really looked, not through me, not around me, directly at me, and it felt like he was peeling back every layer of certainty I had built since waking up. "Then go," he said, stepping back just enough to clear the path completely. And that should have made it easy, should have given me exactly what I needed. But something in his expression, something controlled and unreadable, made it feel like a test I had not agreed to take. I hesitated, just for a second, and that second stretched longer than it should have, long enough for doubt to slip in, for the thought to form that maybe leaving was not as clean as I wanted it to be, that maybe there were things I did not understand yet. "You see," he added quietly, not moving, not pushing, "you are already questioning it." And that irritated me more than anything else, because he was right, and I did not want him to be. "No," I said quickly, pulling the door open this time, the cool air from the hallway brushing against my skin like a reminder that there was still a world outside of him. "I am leaving," and I stepped out before he could respond, before I could change my mind again. The door closing behind me with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. The hallway felt different now, longer, quieter, like it was watching me leave, and I walked faster than I needed to, my steps echoing just slightly as I made my way to the elevator, pressing the button with more force than necessary, as if that would speed things up. When the doors finally opened, I stepped inside quickly, turning to face forward as they slid shut, cutting off the view of his apartment, his world, his presence. And for a moment, I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, my shoulders relaxing just enough to feel the shift. But even as the elevator began to descend, smooth and silent, I could not shake the feeling that something had followed me, not physically, not something I could see, but something quieter, something that stayed in the way my thoughts kept circling back to him. to the way he spoke, the way he watched, the way he seemed so certain about things I barely understood. I told myself it was nothing, just the aftermath of a strange night, just the effect of being somewhere unfamiliar. But as the numbers dropped one by one and the city came back into view through the glass, I realized something I did not want to admit yet, that leaving his world had not felt like escaping. It had felt like stepping away from something unfinished. And that was the kind of feeling that did not disappear, no matter how far you walked. I told myself I would not look back, not at the building, not at the street it stood on, not at anything that could tie me to that version of the night. But the reflection in the glass doors as I stepped outside betrayed me anyway, showing me a silhouette that still looked like someone standing between two worlds instead of fully in one. The morning air was cooler than I expected, crisp enough to wake me up in a way sleep had not, and I pulled my jacket tighter as I started walking, not toward anything specific, just away, putting distance between me and the kind of control that had felt too easy to fall into. The city was already waking up. Taxis moving, people crossing streets with coffee in their hands, conversations blending into that familiar noise I had always relied on, and I focused on that, on the normal rhythm, the predictable pace, telling myself this was where I belonged, not in quiet apartments high above everything else, not in spaces where every word carried weight. I checked my phone as I walked, expecting missed calls, messages, something from my real life pulling me back in completely, but the screen was empty, except for the time, and that emptiness felt louder than anything else, like a pause I did not ask for. I turned onto a street I recognized, finally grounding myself in something familiar, the small cafe on the corner just opening, the owner flipping the sign to welcome early customers, and without thinking too much about it, I stepped inside, drawn by the warmth, by the smell of fresh coffee, by anything that felt simple and real. I ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, more out of habit than necessity, and sat by the window, wrapping my hands around the cup as if that small heat could anchor me, could pull me fully back into my own life. But it did not, because even sitting there, watching people pass by, I felt it, that quiet shift in my thoughts, the way they kept circling back to him, to the way he had spoken, the way he had not stopped me, the way he had made leaving feel like a decision instead of an escape. You were already questioning it, he had said, and I hated how accurate that felt now, how I found myself replaying everything, not just what happened, but what it meant, what I might have missed, what I did not understand. I shook my head slightly, trying to clear it, taking a sip of coffee that had already cooled more than I realized, and told myself again that it was over, that I had left, that whatever he thought or wanted did not matter once I stepped back into my own world. The bell above the cafe door rang softly as someone else walked in, and I glanced up without thinking, expecting nothing. Just another customer, another stranger. But the moment I did, something in my chest tightened, not because it was him, it was not, but because the man who entered paused for a second too long, his gaze sweeping the room before settling briefly on me, like recognition without introduction, like awareness without explanation. I looked away quickly, telling myself I was imagining it, that I was letting one strange night distort everything else. But when I glanced back again, he was already at the counter, ordering, acting like nothing had happened, like he had never looked at me at all. Still, the feeling stayed, subtle but persistent, the sense that something had shifted beyond just my thoughts, that something had followed me out of that building, not in a way I could prove, not in a way I could point to, but in the way the world around me felt just slightly different, like I was no longer moving through it unnoticed. I finished my coffee faster than I intended, setting the cup down with a quiet finality that did not match the unease settling in my chest. And as I stood to leave, I caught my reflection again in the window, clearer now in the daylight, and for a brief second, I saw it. Not fear, not confusion, something else entirely, something I had not expected to find in myself. The beginning of a question I was not ready to answer, because leaving him had not ended anything. It had only made me realize how much of this I did not control anymore. I told myself to ignore it, that the look from the man in the cafe meant nothing, that I was projecting meaning onto something ordinary because my mind had not settled yet. But the feeling did not leave. It followed me out onto the street, lingering just beneath the surface of everything I saw, everything I heard, like a quiet shift I could not undo. I walked faster than usual, not running, not drawing attention, just enough to create distance between me and that moment, and I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the rhythm of the city again, the steady movement of people who had places to be, lives that did not overlap with mine. And for a while, it worked. The normalcy started to return, the noise, the unpredictability, the sense that I was just another person moving through it all unnoticed. But then my phone vibrated in my hand, sudden enough to break that fragile balance, and I stopped mid-step, glancing down at the screen, expecting something familiar, a message from work, a reminder, anything that belonged to my world. But the number was unknown, no name, no context, just a blank space where certainty should have been. I hesitated before answering, my thumb hovering for a second longer than necessary, because something in me already knew this was not random, that nothing since last night had been. And when I finally pressed accept, I did not speak right away, waiting, listening, and the silence on the other end stretched just long enough to feel deliberate. "You left earlier than I expected." His voice came through, calm, steady, exactly the same as before, and I froze where I stood, the noise of the street fading slightly as everything narrowed down to that single moment. "How did you get this number?" I asked, the question coming out sharper than I intended, but I did not care, not when the answer already felt obvious in a way that unsettled me more than anything else. "You are asking the wrong question," Adrian replied, and I could picture him as he spoke, composed, unhurried, like time moved differently for him, like everything unfolded exactly the way he anticipated. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to keep walking, to keep moving forward even as my thoughts started to circle again, faster now, more focused. "Then what is the right question?" I said, and there was a brief pause, not hesitation, more like consideration, as if he was deciding how much to reveal, how much to let me see. "Why do you think I let you leave?" He answered, and something in my chest tightened at that, because it reframed everything, shifted the balance in a way I had not accounted for, turning what I thought was control back into something else entirely. "I did not need your permission," I said quickly, even though the words felt weaker than I wanted them to, and I hated that. Hated the way this conversation was pulling me back into his space, without me physically being there. "No," he agreed, his tone unchanged, "but you still waited for it." And I stopped again, this time without realizing it, standing on the edge of the sidewalk as people moved around me, brushing past without noticing, without understanding that something had just shifted in a way I could not explain. I closed my eyes briefly, steadying myself, trying to find that line again, the one that separated my world from his. But it felt thinner now, less defined, like it had already started to blur. "What do you want?" I asked finally, because that felt like the only question that mattered now, the only one that might give me something solid to hold on to. There was another pause, shorter this time, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but somehow more certain. "To see how far you go before you stop pretending this was chance," he said, and the words settled into me with a weight that did not feel optional, that did not feel like something I could ignore. And for the first time since I left that building, I realized something I had been avoiding, that this was not just about him watching or controlling or deciding. It was about me too, about the way I had stepped into that car, the way I had stayed, the way I was still standing here listening instead of hanging up. And as the line remained open between us, neither of us speaking for a moment that felt longer than it should have, I understood something I did not want to admit yet, that whatever this was, it had already moved beyond something I could walk away from, because part of me was no longer trying to. I should have ended the call, should have pressed the screen and cut the connection before he could say anything else, but my hand stayed still, the phone pressed against my ear like it had already decided for me, and the city around me kept moving, people passing, traffic shifting, everything continuing as if nothing had changed, even though something had. "You think this is a game?" I said finally, my voice quieter now, not because I was afraid, but because I was thinking, really thinking for the first time since this started, and I heard the faintest shift on the other end, not a reaction, more like a tension sharpening. "No," Adrian replied, steady as ever. "I think you are still deciding whether it is." And that hit harder than I expected, because it was true in a way I could not deny. because every step I had taken since last night had not been about escape. It had been about understanding, about testing the edges of something I did not fully see yet. I started walking again, slower this time, no longer trying to outrun the feeling, because I was beginning to realize it was not something I could leave behind by changing streets or turning corners. It was something that had already settled somewhere deeper. And what if I decided is not? I asked, stopping at a crosswalk, watching the light change even though I was not really seeing it. And there was a brief pause before he answered, not hesitation, just precision. Then you walk away, he said simply. And for a second, the simplicity of that answer made me almost laugh, because it sounded easy, too easy compared to everything else that had happened. That is it. I pressed, searching for something more, something hidden, but he did not complicate it. That is it, he repeated, and I realized then that the complexity had never come from him forcing anything. It came from me, from the way I kept stepping closer instead of away. The light turned green. People started moving, but I stayed where I was, the noise rising around me as if trying to pull me back into something ordinary, something predictable. And I took a breath, slow, steady, grounding myself in that moment. And if I do not walk away, I said, and this time, I knew the question mattered, not just to him, but to me, because it was the first honest one I had asked. The silence on the line stretched just enough to make the answer feel deliberate. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, more certain than before. Then you stop pretending you do not feel it, he said, and my chest tightened at that, because there it was, the thing I had been avoiding naming, the shift, the pull, the awareness that this was not just circumstance anymore. I closed my eyes briefly, letting that settle, letting the truth of it move through me without pushing it away this time. And when I opened them again, the city looked the same, but I did not feel the same standing in it. You said no feelings, I reminded him, the words softer now, not a challenge, more like a question I was finally ready to understand. And I heard it then, something different in his response, not hesitation, not doubt, something closer to honesty. I said that before I knew you, he replied, and for the first time since this began, his certainty shifted, not gone, but changed, like something had moved inside it. I let out a slow breath, looking ahead instead of back, because I already knew what was behind me. I already knew where that path led, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider the other direction, not as a mistake, not as something to correct, but as something I had chosen without admitting it. You told me not to fall, I said quietly, almost to myself, and there was no immediate answer, just the steady sound of the line still open between us, and I realized then that he did not need to respond, because the truth had already settled in a place I could not ignore anymore, that this had never been about whether I would fall or not. It had been about the fact that he already had, and somehow, without either of us saying it out loud, I understood the one thing he had not warned me about, that the real danger was not falling for him. It was realizing too late that he had never intended to let me go.